On the morning of June 10, 1944, the village of Oradour-sur-Glane in the Haute-Vienne department of southwestern France was completely normal. Farmers were working their fields. Children were walking to school for a routine attendance check. There was a diphtheria vaccination scheduled that day, which meant children from surrounding hamlets had come in, swelling the village population. Women were doing their shopping along the main street. The bakeries were open. The sun was out. By 6 o'clock that evening, the village no longer existed. 642 people were dead. The buildings were ash and skeletal stone walls, and the soldiers who did it, men of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, had already moved on, headed north toward Normandy, toward the Allied beachheads that had opened just 4 days earlier. Now, the name Oradour-sur-Glane is not unknown. It appears in history books. It is preserved as a memorial site. The French government made the deliberate and extraordinary decision never to rebuild it, to leave the ruins exactly as they were on the evening of June 10, 1944, so that the world could never look away. But what happened afterward to the men who gave the orders, to the commanders who organized the operation, to the officer whose name appears on the documentation authorizing the destruction of that village? That part of the story is told far less often. And it is, in many ways, the more disturbing part, because the simple, documented, historically verified truth is this: the man most responsible for the massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane was never executed. He was never imprisoned for more than a few months. He lived in comfort in West Germany until 1971. He died in his bed. Well, let's go back to the beginning. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich was, by the summer of 1944, one of the most battle-hardened formations in the entire German military. It had fought on the Eastern Front at Kharkov, at Kursk, and had accumulated a reputation not just for combat effectiveness, but for the kind of violence against civilians that the Waffen-SS had made almost systematic in the occupied Soviet Union. When the division was transferred to southern France in early 1944 for rest and refitting, it brought that culture with it. The commander of Das Reich at the time of the Oradour massacre was SS Brigadeführer Heinz Lammerding, born in Dortmund in 1905, an engineer by training, a career SS officer by choice, and by 1944, a man who had already participated in anti-partisan operations in the Soviet Union that had resulted in mass civilian killings. He was not some minor figure, some low-level officer following orders from above and acting outside his authority. He was the divisional commander. His rank was equivalent to a major general. The operation against Oradour-sur-Glane happened within his area of command, with his knowledge, and in the broader context of orders he had already issued regarding the handling of resistance activity in the region. In the days immediately before June 10th, the German occupation forces in the Corrèze and Haute-Vienne regions were under serious pressure. The French resistance, the Maquis, had been conducting sabotage operations against road and rail links that Das Reich desperately needed to move north to Normandy. On June 8th, resistance fighters had ambushed a Das Reich column near Toul, killing several soldiers. The German response to Toul was already horrific. 99 men were hanged from the balconies and lampposts of the town in what was deliberately staged as a public spectacle of terror. That was June 9th. Oradour-sur-Glane happened the very next day. The specific unit deployed to Oradour was the 1st Battalion of the Der Führer Regiment, one of Das Reich's constituent regiments. The battalion commander was SS Sturmbannführer Adolf Diekmann, a name that history has partially remembered, but only partially. On the morning of June 10th, Diekmann received information the exact nature and reliability of which has been disputed by historians ever since, that a German officer was being held captive in or near Oradour-sur-Glane by resistance fighters. Some accounts suggest the name of the village was confused with a nearby hamlet called Oradour-sur-Vers, where there may actually have been some resistance activity. Others suggest the intelligence was simply wrong from the start. What is not disputed is what happened next. Diekmann's battalion, approximately 120 to 150 SS soldiers, surrounded the village at approximately 2 in the afternoon. The residents were ordered to assemble in the village square, supposedly for an identity check. Nobody ran. Nobody resisted. These were farmers and shopkeepers and children. They did what occupying soldiers told them to do, because that was the only rational choice available to them under 4 years of occupation. Several people who happened to be passing through the village that day, salesmen, travelers, A few people who lived nearby and had come in for the diphtheria vaccination were caught in the cordon as well. Then the men and boys were separated from the women and children. The men, 190 in total, were divided into 6 groups and marched into barns and garages around the village. According to survivor testimony and the subsequent French investigation, the soldiers opened fire at leg level first, apparently to incapacitate rather than immediately kill, and then set the structures on fire. Of the 190 men, 6 survived by feigning death and escaping under cover of smoke. One of them, a man named Martial Brissot, died of his wounds shortly after. 5 men survived the massacre of the males of Oradour-sur-Glane. 5. The women and children, 442 of them, were locked inside the village church. The Church of St. Martin. A stone building. Solid walls. No windows at ground level that could be easily broken. The soldiers placed an incendiary device inside the church. When it ignited, the smoke filled the interior, and the congregation panicked. The soldiers outside, according to survivor accounts, fired into the doors and windows as people tried to escape. The roof caught fire and collapsed. Of the 442 women and children locked inside that church, 1 woman survived. Her name was Marguerite Roufanche. She broke a window near the altar, dropped to the ground outside, and crawled into a garden where she hid among pea plants until nightfall. She was found the next morning, wounded by gunfire. She was the only one. After the killings, the soldiers looted the village and burned every building to the ground. They left that evening. The ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane were found by neighboring villagers and, later, French authorities. The identification of victims, or what remained of victims, took weeks. Many bodies were so completely destroyed that they could not be individually identified. 642 people in one afternoon, on a Tuesday. Now, what happened to the men responsible? Adolphe Diekmann, the battalion commander who personally ordered and oversaw the operation, never faced trial. He was killed in action in Normandy on June 29, 1944, less than 3 weeks after Oradour. His death closed, or appeared to close, the most direct line of legal accountability. But Diekmann did not act without context, without a divisional culture that permitted and encouraged this kind of reprisal, and without a chain of command that had already authorized collective punishment of civilian populations in response to resistance activity. That chain of command led, directly, to Heinz Lammerding. According to the records of a German military inquiry, yes, an internal German inquiry held shortly after the massacre, Diekmann's regimental commander, SS Obersturmbannführer Sylvester Stadler, reported that Diekmann had exceeded his orders. Stadler requested that Diekmann face a court-martial for the destruction of Oradour. Lammerding, as divisional commander, approved the initiation of that court-martial proceeding, but Diekmann was dead before it could happen, and the file was closed. This internal inquiry has been cited by some post-war defenders of Lammerding as evidence that Das Reich's High Command did not authorize the massacre. Historians have largely rejected that framing. The broader pattern of Das Reich's conduct in the Soviet Union, at Toulay the day before, and in subsequent operations in France demonstrates a command culture in which mass reprisals against civilians were not aberrations. They were methods. Listen, Lammerding survived the war. He surrendered to British forces in May 1945. He was held briefly. He was transferred. And then, at some point in the immediate post-war chaos, he was released. He returned to West Germany. In 1947, a French military tribunal in Bordeaux tried Lammerding in absentia, meaning he wasn't there, and sentenced him to death for his role in both the Toul hangings and the Oradour massacre. A death sentence, handed down by a legitimate French military court, based on documented evidence, for the murder of hundreds of civilians. West Germany refused to extradite him. This is the point at which the story stops being merely a war crime story and becomes something else, a story about post-war politics, about the priorities of the early Cold War, about the architecture of impunity that allowed dozens of senior Nazi officers to reintegrate into West German professional life because the West German government, and to varying degrees its Western allies, found extradition politically inconvenient. Lammerding returned to Dusseldorf. He re-established himself as a civil engineer, the profession he had trained for before the war. He ran a successful construction firm. He was, by all accounts, a respected figure in his local professional community. He was aware of the French death sentence. French authorities were aware of where he was. The sentence was never carried out. He was never rearrested on the basis of that conviction. He gave occasional interviews in which he denied personal responsibility for Oradour-sur-Glane, maintaining the position that Diekmann had acted beyond his orders. He called the French trial a sham because he hadn't been present to defend himself, which, given that the reason he wasn't present was that West Germany refused to send him, is a remarkable piece of circular reasoning. Now, what was happening on the Allied side during and after the war? General George S. Patton's Third Army, the same Third Army that had swept across France in the late summer of 1944, in one of the most operationally aggressive campaigns of the entire war, had in fact passed through the Preston, Limousin region, the area containing Oradour-sur-Glane, during that advance. Patton himself almost certainly received intelligence about the massacre during the liberation of that region. The ruins of Oradour were a physical landmark, a village that had been entirely destroyed, visible to any Allied column passing through the area. Patton's personal diary and his correspondence from the period do not record a specific entry about Oradour-sur-Glane by name, but his documented attitudes toward German atrocities against civilians and toward the prosecution of war crimes are well established in the historical record. According to his diary entry from August 27, 1944, writing about the evidence of German behavior he encountered throughout the liberation of France, Patton noted that the systematic nature of German crimes against civilian populations was unlike anything he had previously encountered in his understanding of warfare. His view on accountability was equally unambiguous. In a letter to his wife Beatrice, written in September 1944 and preserved at the Library of Congress, Patton expressed the opinion that senior German officers responsible for civilian atrocities should be tried and shot, not imprisoned, not negotiated with, but tried by military tribunal and executed. He was not a man who believed in prolonged legal process as a form of mercy for men he considered murderers. The question of what Patton would have done had Lammerding been captured by Third Army rather than surrendering to British forces is not a historical question. We cannot know the answer with certainty. But we know what Patton did with other SS officers who had documented records of civilian killings. He pushed for their immediate prosecution. He flagged cases to JAG, the Judge Advocate General's Corps attached to his headquarters. He was openly contemptuous of what he called the delay and softness that he believed characterized Allied handling of war criminals in the immediate post-war period. Looking at the documented arrogance of the men who commanded Das Reich, men who carried out the murders at Thule and Oradour within 24 hours of each other, in broad daylight, with no attempt at concealment, what do you think Patton would have done with Lammerding if Third Army had been the ones to find him? Leave your answer in the comments, because what actually happened to Lammerding in the years after the war is something that continues to generate genuine outrage among historians and survivors' families alike. The Bordeaux trial of 1947 was not the only legal proceeding connected to Oradour-sur-Glane. In 1953, a French military court in Bordeaux conducted a second, far more problematic trial, this time of 65 men who were actually present at the massacre and who were, in large part, Alsatians. This is where the legal history of Oradour becomes deeply complicated and, for the survivors and victims' families, deeply painful. He had been annexed by Nazi Germany in 1940, and its young men had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS, under a system the French called the malgré, nous meaning against our will. These were Frenchmen, legally, who had been forced to serve in German military units. Approximately 13 of the 65 men tried in the 1953 Bordeaux trial were Alsatian malgré, new conscripts. The trial produced convictions. Then, under political pressure from Alsatian representatives in the French National Assembly, who argued, with genuine moral complexity, that the conscripts had been victims of Nazi Germany themselves and should not be punished for service, they had been compelled to perform. The French Parliament passed a general amnesty law in February 1953, just weeks after the convictions were handed down. The amnesty covered the Alsatian defendants. It effectively nullified the prison sentences. The village of Oradour-sur-Glane, or rather, the new village built adjacent to the ruins after the war, because the survivors needed somewhere to live, severed its formal bond with the Department of Haute-Vienne in protest. The municipal council returned their Légion d'honneur medals to the French president. The reaction among survivors was one of absolute, documented, uncontained fury. Robert Hebras, one of the 5 male survivors of the massacre, was still alive and giving interviews as recently as 2022, more than 77 years after the event. He described the amnesty as a second betrayal, a second killing, something done not with guns but with legislation. He was 22 years old on June 10, 1944. He spent his entire subsequent life as a witness because he believed that witnessing was the only form of accountability the village had left. He died in February 2023. He was 97 years old. He had outlived every senior officer of Das Reich. He had outlived Heinz Lammerding by 52 years. And the man who commanded the division that destroyed his village had died without serving a single day of a death sentence issued by a French court. Lammerding himself continued to operate his construction business in Dusseldorf throughout the 1950s and 60s. Various French and international efforts to force West Germany to act on the extradition request or at minimum to initiate its own domestic criminal proceedings went nowhere for years. West German authorities opened investigations. Those investigations stalled. The legal reasoning offered at different points included the argument that, under West German law at the time, the specific charges as framed under French law did not map cleanly onto West German criminal statutes in a way that would support prosecution. In 1960, a West German court ruled that there was insufficient evidence to proceed against Lammerding. The ruling has been challenged by historians and legal scholars on multiple grounds, not least because the evidentiary record from the French proceedings was extensive and well documented. Lammerding died on January 13, 1971, in Bad Tölz, Bavaria. He was 65 years old. His death was reported in local West German newspapers. There was no legal proceeding pending against him at the time of his death. He had, to the end, maintained that he bore no personal criminal responsibility for what happened at Oradour-sur-Glane. The ruins of the village still stand. The French government maintains them exactly as they were left on the evening of June 10, 1944. Burned-out cars sit in the streets. The shell of the church rises against the sky. The bones of the village's dead, or what the fire left of them, were interred in a memorial ossuary on the site. Every year, on the anniversary of the massacre, the French president or a senior government representative attends a commemoration ceremony at Oradour-sur-Glane. The ceremony is not theatrical. It is not festive. It is a deliberate, annual act of refusal to allow the event to recede from public consciousness in a country that spent several decades after the war in a complicated, sometimes actively dishonest, relationship with its own memory of the occupation. You see, the history of accountability for Oradour-sur-Glane is not a history of justice delayed. It is a history of justice systematically obstructed by political calculation, by Cold War priorities, by the internal contradictions of trying to rebuild a functional post-war European order while simultaneously holding accountable the men who had run the previous one. Lammerding was not an anomaly. He was one of dozens of senior SS and Wehrmacht officers whose post-war lives in West Germany proceeded without meaningful legal interruption, despite documented evidence of war crimes. The specific mechanism of his protection was West Germany's refusal to extradite its own nationals to face trial in foreign courts, a refusal that was legally grounded in the West German Basic Law adopted in 1949, which prohibited the extradition of German citizens. That legal provision was not changed until 1980, and even then only in limited ways. The French death sentence against Lammerding, handed down in absentia in 1947, expired under French statute of limitations provisions before any mechanism existed to actually enforce it. According to a report filed by the French War Crimes Investigation Unit in 1949, the investigating magistrate noted simply, "The subject resides openly in Dusseldorf and makes no effort at concealment. He didn't need to hide. The system, as it existed, was protecting him without requiring him to do anything at all." Now, the broader context matters here. Das Reich divisions marched from southern France to Normandy in June 1944, a march that included Toulay, Oradour, and numerous smaller incidents of violence against civilians and resistance fighters along the route, has been studied extensively by military historians. Max Hastings, in his 1984 book Das Reich, documented the division's conduct in exhaustive detail, drawing on survivor testimony, German military records, and post-war judicial proceedings. His conclusion was unambiguous. The violence was not incidental, not the product of isolated rogue elements, but systematic, an expression of a command culture that had been forged on the Eastern Front and transplanted to France. The division arrived in Normandy in late June, by which point it was already under investigation by its own chain of command for the Dieckmann court-martial that would never happen. It fought in Normandy, survived the Falaise Pocket, one of the most catastrophic encirclements of the entire Western campaign, and continued fighting until the end of the war. Lammerding was wounded in Normandy and spent several months away from the division. He returned to command briefly in late 1944, before the division's final campaigns in the Ardennes and in the East. His military career, on paper, was one of the more successful in the Waffen-SS. That is a statement worth sitting with for a moment. The man who commanded the division that burned 642 people alive in a French village had, by conventional military metrics, a successful career. He was decorated. He was promoted. He commanded a division in combat on multiple fronts. And then he went home and built buildings. The soldiers who actually carried out the killings at Oradour, the men who locked women and children in a church and set it on fire, were, for the most part, never individually identified, never tried, never convicted. The 65 men tried in Bordeaux in 1953 represented a fraction of the soldiers present that day, and the convictions of most of them were erased by the amnesty law within weeks. Robert Hebras, in an interview given in 2019, was asked whether he had ever felt that justice had been done. His answer, according to the published account of that interview, was a single word followed by a long silence. The word was non. Just no. Nothing more. Because what else is there to say when you are 93 years old and the man who gave the orders died free in his bed 48 years before you? The ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane will outlast everyone who knew what happened there from personal memory. Within a generation, the last living connection to June 10, 1944, will be gone. What remains is stone, burned cars, a memorial, and the documented, verified, historically incontrovertible record of what was done, who ordered it, and what the post-war world chose to do or not do about it. The Church of St. Martin still stands in the ruined village. The roof is open to the sky, it collapsed in the fire, and was never repaired, because the decision was made to leave everything as it was found. On clear days, you can see the sky through the space where the roof used to be. There are flowers placed near the altar. People come from across France and from across the world, and they stand in that space, and they look up through the open roof, and they do not say very much. 642 people. Heinz Lammerding, 1971. His bed. The arithmetic of that does not balance. It is never balanced. And the memorial site at Oradour-sur-Glane exists, in part, precisely because the French government understood at some level that if the legal and political systems had failed to deliver accountability, then the absolute minimum obligation was to refuse to allow the world the comfort of forgetting that the failure had happened. The village stands as it was left, not as a monument to heroism, not as a record of victory, as an accusation permanent, specific, addressed to no one in particular and to everyone.